Thank you, Annie. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see a familiar name slash face or two, and also a lot of new ones here. Our presentation today is on learning and writing intensive community engagement projects that link courses across the curriculum. I'm Brian Hendrickson. I'm an assistant professor of writing studies, rhetoric, and composition at Roger Williams University in Bristol and Providence, Rhode Island. And Jack, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm Jack Fusaro. I'm an undergrad at Roger Williams University, and I'm currently studying history and legal studies there.
And I'm Rebecca Farias, and I graduated from Roger Williams University last year, and I'm currently a master's student at Providence College, also studying history.
Okay, so I'm having a little bit of an issue already with this. Let's see. Okay, got a little bit of a reverse slide thing. Of course, I've got to start off on the wrong foot, right? So this whole thing came out of a recognition of a contradiction of sorts, that we have a lot of long-term, like large-scale studies that seem to suggest that students find clearly defined writing tasks limited to just an individual course, an individual assignment, working with an individual professor, that these things can be really meaningful and engaging, and they tend to identify that over and over again. And yet, some of our foundational theories in how we think about learning within and across the curriculum suggest that the kinds of ways we thought about traditional writing assignments tend to inadequately simulate the more complex, distributed ways that we actually think and learn and write in the workplace, but also in some of our more advanced sort of academic kind of contexts, like collaborative research environments, where you might be stepping into a project midway and having to figure out how you fit into that sort of thing. So what do we do with that? I'd like to think about that less as just something that we kind of throw our hands up about, and more as like a learning opportunity for us and maybe for our students. Approaching this research project, I came at it from a cultural historical activity theory perspective, which teaches us to look at contradictions between various systems of thought, of doing, as catalysts for transformative learning. Learning that isn't just about sort of figuring out how to do this one thing, but it is actually people changing the entire sort of system in which they're working. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to really reflect on, what does this mean when all of these large-scale studies tell us students want this thing, and yet our theories tell us something else about what transformative learning really looks like. I think cultural historical activity theory, or what I call CHAT, also shows us, it helps us out because it teaches us how writing is constantly mediating how we learn. It's a tool that we use to learn. So we care about that a lot in writing across the curriculum, right? We talk about writing to learn. It helps us understand writing transfer, because we're never just in one system where we're learning. We're usually learning across systems, and we're trying to move back and forth between them. And it also highlights, again, this idea of the importance of contradiction as a critical incident that compels us to have to figure out what's going on here. Something's broken, right? And now I need to figure out how to fix it. It also draws our attention to how important collaboration is in how we teach people how to learn, that no one's learning alone, and that we need to make that a little bit more explicit. And then lastly, it draws attention to the importance of agency, that the learner actually has to have the capacity to be able to control, and not just control, but change the learning situation in which they're in order to have that kind of, that higher level transformative learning experience. And I've begun to think about what that means. How do we define that learning disposition in students? And I've been getting, in some of my scholarship, I've been calling that a disposition of rhetorical engagement, to highlight that sort of writing mediated portion of engaged learning. Jack, you want to just give us the question here that we had for our research project then?
Yes. So the general research question we had was, how do students describe their encounters with learning challenges in collaborative, writing intensive community engagement projects that involve multiple stakeholders and that span courses and semesters? And how does that uh, help us better understand how to cultivate dispositions of rhetorical engagement?
So I think it's also important that we consider the physical and academic context of where these courses and these activities are taking place. So as we stated before, we're situated at Roger Williams University. Roger Williams is a private, not-for-profit university that is the main campus is in Bristol, Rhode Island, which is a very small town. And that might mean that it's somewhat more isolated from the more urban environments, or that the students grow up in a particular way. There's also a satellite campus that offers as well. We have approximately 5,000 students. We're 80% undergrad, so we're more concentrated towards that. Another potential limitation is that we are 80% white, our student body. So that could be some sort of limitation on our study as well in the diversity sense. And most of the students are residential, meaning that they live in Bristol. So again, with the environmental connotations there. So Roger Williams University has a professional emphasis, and we also really strongly emphasize the interdisciplinary connections through liberal arts, because we have a general education program. We're also a Carnegie Community Engagement classification, which means that we emphasize the importance of community engagement in addition to those regular textbook classes that we have. We don't have a writing across the curriculum program, but however, we do have a 2-course writing sequence, which means that the student is required to take at least 2 writing courses based on their skill level. And we also do not have a writing major, but we also have the Gen Ed concentration for writing, and we have a minor in professional and public writing, which I also did myself, and I found that to be very beneficial in my writing studies.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm going to go over a few of the projects that were included in the study that we're recounting to you here today. So the first project began in the summer of 2017 and then was picked up by one of my classes in the fall, where there were education studies interns working on a literature review on culturally responsive, age-appropriate pedagogy or programming. And in this case, they were doing this for a breast cancer resource foundation that wanted to be able to develop programming, similar programming for children whose parents would visit their center. So have been diagnosed with cancer and are moving through some stage of that. So my technical writing students ended up choosing the course or the project they wanted to work on. And the idea was that we were working with our community partnership center to identify a project that wasn't quite ready for the partner. And I think if any of you have ever done a community engagement project, you know at the end of the semester, it's sometimes not completely ready for prime time. And so we thought we could use this class to polish up what the students had done previously, make it a little bit more professional, make it a little bit more implementable for our community partner. Then the students also had to figure out how they were going to create that document, not just for the community partner, but for the Community Partnership Center itself to kind of show off in terms of the work that students are doing at the university. Another project that was involved here spanned over the 2018-19 academic year. And again, I'm sort of having issues with my, let's see, okay, there we go. So in this case, we had, as our final project, honors first year writing students were working on a proposal for the Providence Police Department's Community Relations Bureau, but not just for them, actually for another class, so that what they could do is pass this project on to the next semester. So the website that the Community Relations Bureau wanted developed could actually be developed by the next class. So my first year writing students were really just doing that work. And so they had to think about those multiple stakeholders, right? The police department, but also the next students who are going to take on this project. The second half then, it was students in web development and also students in my digital writing class collaborating across those different sections to be able to develop a content strategy and also proof of concept for what that website would look like. And then they're also having to show up at our donor related or facing events to kind of show off the work that they were doing and present it in poster and web-based fashion to prospective donors. And then lastly, I had students in one of our sort of interdisciplinary gen ed classes, which is themed around literature, philosophy, and the examined life, where we really focused in on issues of ethics and equity the whole semester. But it was only their final project where we shifted focus into working on issues of housing inequities in Rhode Island. And they had to create a proposal for doing a digital storytelling partnership, a digital storytelling project in partnership with a housing policy center. The second semester then, students in a digital writing class took that proposal and had to use that to develop a proof of concept for this project by creating their own videos, creating their own web-based text, and then again, presenting that at various functions across the university. So what data did we collect here? If you can see on the left-hand column, the course type broken down ended up coming from about 7 different sections and a total of about 76 students and this is a little bit arbitrary, but about 247 separate artifacts. And so all of this was kind of reflective writing that the students were doing. Sometimes it was part of a final portfolio. Sometimes it was individual assignments that students were doing across a series of weeks. Sometimes it was, 3 assignments they did across the entire semester. So there's a lot of different variety in the kinds of reflective activity that students were being asked to do. So how do we code this data? The first thing we did is we applied cultural historical activity pretty straightforwardly. And I wanted to look at it in terms of just thinking about, how are students articulating the project objectives? Do they seem to understand that there might be multiple objectives for multiple audiences? And that they have to really have an understanding of that project context in order to be able to wrap their heads around that. And do they really appreciate and value sort of the process of having to go through this in a collaborative way, rather than, let's say, the traditional way that you might structure an assignment, which is I lay out all the guidelines, right? And the student fulfills those guidelines in a sort of checking off boxes fashion. Once we'd gone through that process, though, we really realized that what we were most interested in is where the students were really explicitly discussing the learning challenges they confronted. And we were interested in how they were discussing those learning challenges. So we ended up coming up with a way of categorizing how students talk about those things. The main category you could see is this sort of 2-stage color coding scheme, where one, in our coding sheet, we would mark the name of the student here. And not because we really cared that the student themselves was getting something or not getting something, but that the reflective writing showed some evidence of this. And so if it was green, it was that over the course of their reflections, we could see that they were sort of valuing and understanding the role of encountering a critical incident, a learning challenge, and having to move through that. And that was essential to better appreciating and understanding what they were learning as part of that project. And then we also would mark an individual passage as saying, okay, this is someone who's saying this is helpful. This is someone who's saying it's sort of helpful. It's not very helpful. And you can see the same thing in the name marked, right? So the yellow is important because it's like the student may be indicating that they recognize that there was a learning challenge and they got through it, but we're not really clear. Do they really value it? Do they really understand it? There's not enough evidence to really show. And of course, the red would be that it's they're actually literally saying this was really annoying and I wish it didn't happen, or that sort of thing. We also had these other categories here where we're marking out, like, were they saying that engaging with community stakeholders was helpful? Were they saying that developing teamwork strategies was helpful? Were they saying that going through a writing process was helpful? But we're not going to sort of weight you down with all of those little micro factors here for the presentation. What I thought now is I'd transition back over to my colleagues here, and they're going to describe the levels of coding that we came up with and provide some examples to show you sort of how are students reflecting through a green level, a green-yellow level, a yellow, and on down, so that we get a real sense of the spectrum of student reflection when we're looking at it through this lens. Rebecca, you want to take this on?
Sure. So as you can see here, we coded this student, their entire body of research that we had as green, but we also coded this specific quotation as green. So we kind of looked at this as showing that the student values the critical incident. So they recognize a challenge. They not only did they recognize it, but they identified what helped them transition to a better understanding of that challenge and what they learned from that challenge, which kind of broadened the context of their learning and also tied into the secondary category of objectives and writing process knowledge and all of that. So I will now read you the quote. The first definition of technical writing, dealing with how different people work together, is something we clearly see in this project. So there's a sense of identifying the aim of the project. This class consists of undergraduate students living in different places, different skills and abilities. Inside the class, we have the Cancer Resource Foundation, dealing with even more diversity than our classroom. So that is an excellent grasp of what the context of the project is so far. The task of putting these two groups together, who for the most part have nothing in common, is almost counterintuitive. Outsourcing for a foundation dealing with cancer and specifically seeking help for a program that would be made for kids of cancer patients is something that I assume almost none of us have experience with. So again, identifying that kind of discomfort, that's the critical moment right there, the critical incident. But it works. So here's the recognition of how they can solve this issue, or at least approach this issue. Social structure within the classroom are example with different in care are almost needed for success. From working on this project, I have begun to wonder if it is possible or even desirable for everyone to be as ambitious and focused on the project. This is a lesson that builds our writing process knowledge, which can only be learned through hands-on experience and working with other people, such as an organization like the Cancer Resource Foundation. So for this example, we coded the body of the students' research, and what we can extrapolate from that is that they were approaching critical understanding, but they weren't quite there yet, or they weren't able to articulate the grasp of that challenge as well as, per se, a student that was marked green. But they're not in the red zone, meaning that it's not that they missed the mark entirely. However, we marked this particular quotation green because they do identify the challenge, even if they weren't able to fully articulate how they were going to overcome that challenge. So I will also read this quotation for you. Participating in this project was a very new and interesting experience for me. So that's a casual identification of the discomfort. I have not had a lot of experience trying to work with such professional and real-world material. It provided a different perspective knowing that I was looking at a real police department website that needed insightful and analytical changes rather than viewing it with the mindset that everything was theoretical and didn't really matter. I felt that this was a challenge because the work I did impact on others, and therefore I felt pressure to really make productive recommendations that could impact how a community uses the site. So they're identifying that they could make these productive changes. I was able to implement a lot of my prior knowledge from both class content and my area of study, graphic design. My group made the decision to split the work and which area of our website we wanted to analyze based on our skills. A particularly useful resource that the book provided us with was the Universal Design for Documents. This resource in particular gave us a new perspective on what professional standards are out there for things like equitable use. We were then able to take that document, look through our recommendations, and make changes to them based on that professional standard. So we can clearly see that the student is working through their challenges and identifying what resources they can use. However, they're focusing so much on the deliverable that they're looking at the resource as like they have to copy that almost. And that's not really solving the problem organically. That's just what they thought the guidelines would be. So for that reason, that's why the student was marked yellow. I think this one is me as well. I don't want to step on any toes, but
You're right. That's you.
Okay, I'm sorry. So this was clearly marked yellow. I won't reiterate what that category means, but the student understood. It is kind of unclear if they understood how to overcome the challenge or if they were leading towards a more full understanding of the project itself. So this student wrote, There were a lot of bumps in the road in my particular project, and as well, a group that had some participants that weren't truly interested in participating. I guess you could say I was able to experience the real world of what it's like to be a project manager. So they clearly faced some difficulty there, but again, they don't elaborate on what that challenge was. What is it like in the real world context? That sense of occupation.
Thanks, Rebecca. Here, let me transition over here to Jack, who's going to take on our last two examples for you.
Hi. So this one is coded as red yellow. So this is a person that didn't really get it, but we found this quote like it kind of was on the verge of getting something we want or getting that understanding we were looking for. So the quote says, usually professors will have a specific way or website that we should research topics on and a certain way of how to organize that research. The purposeful lack of specific directions from my professor let me use my own thought process and style of writing to find information on my own. This learning tactic allowed me to research my desired content in a quicker, more efficient manner. So the student got that it like didn't have any direction, which is good. That's what we want them to understand. But it didn't take the next step in like really saying um, if that's uh, what the process involves, or if that's just what the professor wants to hear. They also took the lack of guidance as something that they could just kind of do whatever they want with instead of working towards the goal that they had to hit. The final one was coded red, so they really don't understand the process, like the um, the difficulty with the process. The quote says, "My history of writing has trained me well in writing concisely and clearly. Technical writing felt like applying all of my writing skills to a real-world project for a kind of client. Most of the semester, it was very unclear what tasks were required of us due to the nature of the project. Collecting research from the previous team of education students provided us with a starting line for organizing teams to develop programs. In the beginning, little was required of me by my group. However, later more responsibilities were given to me to contribute to the project. While formatting the final proposal, I learned from more about technical writing than I feel other writing assignments did. Putting a professional document together with a team helped me understand the professional tone and context it needs to be uh, to support the professional context." So they understood that there was an issue and that there's like always going to be a struggle with the learning process, but they didn't see that as part of the process, but more of just like a hindrance. Also, the student said that they were prepared, but didn't use any of that preparation to kind of step up and take a leadership role within this project. Um, so all in all, these were the trends we noticed between the green greens and the red reds. So the green greens were like the team leaders. They all had various experience, and they weren't very common. And that can be said for the red reds, except for the fact that they were not the team leaders. They kind of sat behind and let everyone else, come to conclusions for them.
Yeah, so what do we make about that distinction between our green greens and our red reds there? Well, we talked a little bit about that, you know, certainly we can't draw any kind of causal links here, but we can see that there's obviously this correlation between someone having the kind of reflection you hope a student has coming out of a project like this and them happening to be a project lead. That there was pretty much I don't think there was ever a green that wasn't from somebody who played a team lead role in one of these projects. So that, I mean, it does seem to confirm this idea that if someone's really showing what we could describe as probably the most authentic account of some kind of transformative learning experience, where they're really sort of rhetorically engaging in a project and having to come up with new ideas of thinking about what does it mean to communicate and collaborate on a team, that also coincides with them taking some kind of agentive role in that process. Um, Again, it's like, do they come in with the agency already? I mean, so looking at their larger set of reflections, Sometimes it's very clear that some of these students, they talk about prior experiences that prepared them for taking a leadership role. And in other cases, it's very clear that they were not at all prepared. And I can think of particular students who had the green greens who, it was giving them the leadership role to keep them from dropping out of college. So the agency was not there, and yet going through that, it really gave them the capacity to be able to come out with that kind of transformative learning, indicative reflection. But even if a student had had all these prior experiences before, they were still talking about how nothing prepared them for this. And that was really key to the critical incident, which makes me think that like there aren't a lot of these kinds of experiences that are necessarily intentionally preparing students to be able to cultivate within themselves these kinds of dispositions of rhetorical engagement. So some questions we have coming out of this: how do we create more opportunities for all students to take on leadership roles? Does that mean that we need to really be thinking about just increasing the number of opportunities? By increasing the sheer volume or frequency, you're going to more likely create those kinds of opportunities for every student. That's a question I'd like to toss at you all. Oh, let me go back here. So the reality, though, is that the vast majority of our students were not green, green, or red, red in their reflections, right? They were somewhere in between. And of course, we don't know why that is the case. Is it because, reflective writing is just another assignment that they have to complete out of their 6 classes that they're taking? And, they're going through a tough breakup and they're working a 30-hour-a-week job and, whatever. And it's not coming, right? It doesn't matter what they actually learned. We're not seeing it there. Is it just that they haven't practiced reflection enough to be able to articulate those ideas? There's a lot of questions we have about why we have a preponderance of students that are really sitting in the middle there. However, I mean, there does seem to be some support there for why we see in these large scale studies that ask students about what do they find meaningful and engaging. They're not talking about the most difficult learning experience that they've had, the most new thing. So maybe it is that most students don't need to go through this kind of critical incident that we focus on so much when we talk about issues of learning transfer, or when we talk about real engaged learning that goes to that level of sort of, this is a transformative experience for students. Maybe not all of our classes need to be transformative experiences for students to learn and grow as writers. Rebecca, would you mind taking that first bullet? Because I think this came out of some of your own reflection on implications.
Yeah, sure. So the type of reflections that the students are doing. So the question that we have here is, would better or more frequent or more varied or creative genres of reflection and different kinds of media, would that increase the amount of involvement and therefore increase the amount of green coding that we would have gotten? And how do we avoid that kind of repetitive reflection fatigue in students where they feel like they just have to jot everything down, as Dr. Hendrickson was saying, to get it done for the assignment or to please the teacher, or just to say what they think they need to say without actually saying what they're thinking, if that makes any sense. And it kind of reminded me of my experience during my writing minor, when one of my professors for an environmental rhetoric class actually had us act out our reflections as skits, or we could choose any kind of artistic performance that we wanted to do. And that was something I had never encountered before. And I think something of that nature might not classroom, but it might be really useful to students that have trouble or don't feel like expressing themselves through that same written reflection.
Thank you. Yeah, so something I was already hitting at before, right, is rhetorical engagement a disposition we should cultivate in all students? That cultural historical activity theory borrows from other educational anthropology kind of work that talks about levels of learning. And it's just like that learning 3 where you're able to transform a whole system, right? Most of us are not going to be able to have that. So is this a reasonable goal to try to build into all of our curriculum? Do we just say, hey, let's keep this for students who are signing up for co and extracurricular opportunities? A lot of my other research is looking at those opportunities that happen in the STEM extracurriculum and the kinds of transformative things that can happen there that tend to not happen in curricular learning and writing situations. But to me, that's kind of sad to think that it's only going to be something that we just imagine that the student who's going to go extra for is going to have somewhere outside of the class. You know, I think that maybe the alternative is like, how do we create and encourage students to want to choose optional and easily accessible, so it's not just the honors curriculum where all the students get the transformative learning because we know that type of student wants it. These kinds of pathways that are interdisciplinary, that have students sort of integrate their learning across courses and semesters. They're engaged in projects potentially long-term, as Jack ended up being, as somebody who was in that gen ed literature and philosophy class who I ended up, I don't know, talking into, or I think maybe, I don't know what I did to get him to be involved in this years-long research project, but it happened, right? And that there are opportunities for things to be collaborative, for things to be community engaged. So we get a sense of what does it mean to have to really work with multiple stakeholders who have different interests and ideas about what you need to accomplish. And then that being something that can really provide kind of a place for transformative learning and the cultivation of rhetorical engagement to live within the curriculum. And then, of course, the further question becomes, how can we more directly actually research these things, design them, and then assess them, not just as this is this individual student's experience within this, because if we're talking about transformative learning or rhetorical engagement as being something that is inherently social and is inherently about transforming the material context, the structures within the learning environment itself, then we have to come up with better ways of trying to measure student learning beyond just looking at their individual writing samples or their individual reflections or their individual survey responses or course evaluations or whatever it is, our traditional way of looking at that. And I don't have those answers, but this is stuff that I'm wanting to sort of chip away at. So I'm hoping those will be some opportunities for generative discussion, because I'd love to hear some of your ideas about that. With that, we open the floor to any kinds of questions. Just know if you're not a chat or a question person, you can always send me an email on the side if something, you know, you got an earworm sort of working its way at something, please toss it to us there. But otherwise, we have a good chunk of time for any kind of questions or comments. Please feel free to, you can use any method if you want to use chat or raise your hand or just unmute. We're a small enough group, so. Hey, Tom, go for it.
Yeah, hey, how are you doing? How's everybody? Brian, Jack, and Rebecca, no, I really appreciate the presentation. And the question you get to, Brian, about sort of preparation, I think, has been one that's been on my mind as I've been looking at undergraduate research experiences and really thinking through the differences that I've started to notice across disciplines. And so I was kind of curious about experiences from a faculty perspective and a student perspective on that. In particular, the phenomenon that I've been looking at was a lot of these STEM disciplines have sort of ongoing projects where students get to step into these sites of actual research that become, that help them develop longitudinally and give them these opportunities to get this sort of what they refer to as real world experience, you know, whether it is that or not, I'm not sure, but a lot of the humanities experiences that I'm learning about and observing don't. It seems a little bit, Brian, like your course design is trying to do some of that work in making this something that happens ongoing. And so one of the things I'm really kind of curious about is what is the experience of doing that designing? What is that experience of being a student? And how do we think about that more intentionally on the humanities writing studies side?
I think that's a fantastic question. I'd love to hear even what, someone like maybe Rebecca has to say about that. But I will just say that I think that, STEM's getting better at trying to figure this stuff out. Um, I think traditionally it has been an experience that you have as a capstone, or if you're a motivated student who knows how to make the right move, get the right research project, the right internship. So that is all kind of extracurricular kind of stuff, right? It's reserved for the student who knows how to make that move for whatever reason. I think that, there's a lot more effort now to create first year experiences, right, that compel students to want to be passionate and interested about learning in STEM, and that can be transformative. And then I think there's a lot of challenges in terms of connecting the dots between that first year experience and that senior experience, right? It's like, what are you going to do? Because you have to take all of these courses, right? And they're going to load you up on it in your sophomore year with your chemistry and your whatever, right? And so, like, I think that's crucially for why we lose so many students in those years, right? Especially when we talk about underrepresented minority students. So, and I guess one thing I'm saying, I think that all of us can do a little bit better, but I think you're exactly right. I think that we have maybe a longer way to go, even in the humanities, in terms of showing our students that the work is collaborative, right? Often enough, and it does involve engaging multiple stakeholders. I don't know, Rebecca, do you want to just say anything about that as someone who's just finished your undergraduate and is moving on to your master's right now, about your own experiences? I mean, do you see these kinds of things in your classes? Do you feel like you got enough opportunity for that? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I actually didn't hear the first part of the question because my Zoom cut out. Would you mind repeating it for me?
Tom, you want to go ahead and just kind of quickly reframe that?
Sure, I'll try. I mean, the question was kind of half-baked when I asked it, but essentially, I've been looking at undergraduate research experiences, experiential learning, and we're noticing a general trend in the research that I've been doing, that a lot of STEM students have these opportunities to participate in ongoing research programs that really seem to give them a leg up in terms of, I think, Brian, what you were saying is like the preparation for real world or research life or whatever that disciplinary professional life might be. And I think in a lot of times the humanities, we just don't have those ongoing programs that offer students those opportunities. And so it sounds like what you all are doing is a little bit of that in terms of course design, but then also the two of you, Rebecca and Jack, working as undergraduate researchers over an extended period of time. So I was just kind of curious what your experiences were like, and how they've kind of helped you transition into your graduate experiences now, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I actually found that I got more hands-on experience at Roger Williams than I did at my graduate level courses. I'm almost done with my master's in history right now. And I feel like at the master's level, it's more emphasis on strictly you honing your specific skill or your specific concentration. Like that's determinant of all the humanities right now, unfortunately, is that you get so specialized that you kind of lose track of the bigger picture, which is something that we kind of connected with in the research here. But yeah, like at Roger Williams, we did a really good job, especially we had a very small like concentration of history professors, and they were just amazing with getting us that community engagement. Like we worked with Bristol Historic Preservation Society. I worked with Plymouth Plantation. I went to London. I wrote and funded my own grant, and like none of this would have been possible without the guidance of my professors and the built-in component to get that, not only the rhetorical engagement, but actually engage with other people in your profession. And I know I can't speak for STEM at all, but I know that it might be a little bit different because I think it's so much easier to envision a career with STEM when in the humanities it might just be some people are pursuing it as an interest or a supplement to something else, or they don't know what their career might be. They might not go into that at all. So it might be harder to do the hands-on stuff, but that doesn't make it any less valuable, in my opinion.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that Rebecca is one of those maybe also examples of the uncommon student, right? Who's going to go out and use a class research project to write a grant to bring her whole class to the on a field trip, right, and get it and like execute. So that's pretty impressive. So one of the reasons why I was very happy to bring her onto the project. I'm starting to answer some or respond to some of your comments in the comments section. But Laura, did you have a question or a comment?
I do, and I've been trying to figure out how to formulate this question in a more in a more streamlined way. But I was really caught by this conversation about how the reflections of the students were a lot of times in between, that they go through the motions or they don't go far enough. And I'm trying to connect that to the experiences that I had this past semester with trying to get my upper level students to push beyond these writing projects where there's already an answer out there somewhere, because they're always trying to figure out what the right answer is and then write that down. And so I started doing something that was marginally successful. And I guess what I'm looking for here is feedback. And that is that I am working in STEM. And for these students who are super smart, I had a really small class and just 6 students in this class, super smart students. And I started giving them databases that were available online for studies that were being done, where I would provide them the data and I would say, ask a question and answer it, go. And they already knew, they know the scientific method. I have worked with these particular students for 2 years before this class. And so a couple of the students were like, oh yeah, we're down with this. And they produced some truly horrible work, but that's okay because they did it. They came up with their questions. They answered their questions. But I had 2 particular students, one who said, this is the worst ever. I kind of hate this. I need you to tell me what to do. And the other student who said, this is the best ever. I've never had a class this awesome before. And I'm like, wow, what I'd really like is to keep the high and help the low, and I don't know, is there feedback? Like, how do I scaffold that student who's going, I hate you so much right now, while preserving the opportunity for that really outgoing student to just, bust a gut and ask her questions and fail miserably and have a great time trying? Like, somewhere there's an in-between, maybe? What do you think? That was a horrible question. I apologize.
No, it's not. It was actually, there's a lot in there. And I could probably, ramble on a little bit thinking through that. One thing I want to say is I want to hear more about this question answer prompt. So maybe I might be emailing you or something like that after this.
That's fine.
But yeah, I don't know. Other people have thoughts about that? Because I think that there's a question that I think that our own study raises, which is just that. Like, is it? It seems like you have such a varied sort of kind of responses, right? And it reminds me of just even, I think one of the things that kind of compels me to think about this is just, my own student eval feedback for years, right? Which is that, on the one hand, the students who say, I really like that, he makes us think and he lets us make our own decisions. And then of course the alternative to that is, his instructions are unclear. And sometimes I just wish he'd tell us what to do, kind of thing. Right. So I imagine there's probably some sweet spots in there, and maybe it would appeal to the vast majority of students, but would it get to those kinds of experiences that we say we want for them? And what does that mean? I guess I'm thinking particularly about this from a WAC perspective. Like, what promises and perils does it raise for how we think about the role that WAC can play in integrating these kinds of experiences across the curriculum? I don't have all the answers right now, but those are some questions that I have coming out of this.
Yeah, and I really like that you mentioned that, because for me, the writing component is part of where they can fail, and then I can help them work on that. And it's sort of this well, I think of it as this opportunity to teach them that failing can be amazing. That's where the learning is. And I'm going to be right in there with you. But you do get a lot of different response depending on their sort of their stress level or sort of where they are. And so maybe there's not a middle road. Maybe you either go all out or you don't. Maybe Jack and Rebecca can give more feedback on this as to what it would feel like as a student to be having this, because I want them to push now while they can, because later on failure will become less of an option. But right now, the absolute worst thing that can happen is, oh no, they get a lower grade. That's not going to kill them, right? And I will help them with the grade. So I don't know, do you more recent students have any feedback about giving sort of an assignment where the world is your oyster and you have to sort of make your own way?
Jack, I'd be interested to just hear your thoughts on this, because we haven't really heard from you. And I mean, when we're talking about that, like do you want like every class to be like a major learning challenge, or is there a right balance in there? Is there a way that people can do this more intentionally to make it effective? What do you think?
I think you need to strike some kind of balance. I mean, it's, as a student, if you're thrown in like into just a class where it's just like, you know, you have this objective to complete, do it how you see fit, you're already like, the student's already overwhelmed and just going, well, some will be like, well, I want to do this, 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 and this to get it absolutely perfect. And then you'll have the other students who will go, well, I just want to get to the end. I don't really care how I get there. So you got to strike a balance with that. I think the lack of direction is helpful, but you've got to give them little breadcrumbs to be like, all right, nudge them along the way so they can kind of see, almost like seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I mean, I think part of the thing I think we have to be thinking about too is like, if we're really thinking about this from like a WAC perspective, right? From an institutional kind of change model. Like, what role do we have as folks who are thinking about writing across the curriculum, or even across a particular program's curriculum, of trying to more intentionally scaffold in this kind of learning over time and at key points that can be very clearly designated as such, so that students know when they get to this point, this is the experience they're going to have. And they know they're going to have one of those a semester, right? Not in every class, but it's going to be in particular classes that they can maybe, that they can go into realizing this is going to be that class for me, right? And everybody talks about this being that class, and we always know we're gonna get into that here. But it does require some intentionality. It can't just be, right, me making it up as I go, and especially doing it in a situation where it's just gen ed, right? Because I think that we have this habit of just trying to pack in so much of the high impact stuff into whatever sort of gen ed first year kind of courses we have, and it doesn't give that really nice scaffolding where a student gets to build up and continue to encounter increasingly more difficult challenges in an intentional and mentored sort of way up through their 4 years or whatever.
So I wanted to ask a question about assessment, because you brought that up and the difficulty of assessing all of these things. All these things went through my head when you said that. But I know that at our institution, which is a community college, we only have 2 years, technically with the students, they stay longer than that, but essentially we usually have 2 years worth of courses full-time with them, and maybe another year to make up for some things that they needed to make up for before they got to our classes. But one of the challenges that we have with assessing for writing cross curriculum is, how do we note their progress from beginning to end? And so one of the things that we've been talking about quite a bit is an e-portfolio system. And I'm wondering if you guys have an e-portfolio system at your institution, or if you've thought about that. for assessment purposes.
I keep plugging into all the strategic planning conversations. So we don't have an e-portfolio system, but I would love for us to be able to have that, and I'd love for it to be a way of measuring a number of other competencies. So
Exactly.
you know, we've been pushing in a lot of our DEI work to build in you know, intercultural fluency, right, as a key competency that we could track, right, in a student's development across the curriculum. And you know, an e-portfolio would be fantastic for that, right? And it's fantastic for normalizing reflection and for teaching students that that they're not doing it just for nothing, but this is something that they can be thinking of that has a life after they leave the institution potentially, and they can point back to it as a showcase of their learning.
Mhm.
So yes, I mean, I'm all about it. Can you, yeah, if you want to contact my, you know, let her know. I appreciate that.
If you can do
Yeah.
that for me too, we'll swap.
Sure.
Things.
That sounds good.
Thanks.
Any other last questions or remarks here? I'm still catching up in the comments here, but in the chat.
I think, Brian, another question that came up that you're asking about. I was doing some research on seniors' experiences across their years here at my institution. And one of the questions that came up to us is the aspect of identity, which is not so much, I think, what you're talking about with rhetorical disposition, but similar, right? Our field is very interested in developing this idea of a writing identity. And you kind of ask, is rhetorical disposition really worth it? Or is that what we should be aiming for? I don't have an answer. I just, maybe my answer is like, it's something I've also been thinking about. Like, why are we so invested in that identity when our field also looks at writing as something that's embedded in a larger activity? Like when you come from that kind of idea from like chat or other sort of situated learning approaches. So I don't know, that idea is pretty compelling to me, and that thought is pretty compelling, but it is still part of the way in which we think about developing our students. So it's sort of another contradiction, I think. Pretty interesting.
No, thank you for bringing that up, Tom. I do think that sometimes we get a little bit obsessed, and maybe it's important to have that conversation at IWAC, right? About trying to, I think sometimes us writing studies scholars, we're so used to people maybe underplaying the importance of writing to us, right? Or not appreciating how important it is to pay attention to that in their classrooms, that we oversell, right? How important writing is in someone's learning. And sometimes I get hung up on that and trying to describe the kind of engagement that I've been seeing across my research projects. So with some of my longitudinal research I'm doing with STEM students as part of an NSF study we've done, and then another one that I've done tracking students over several years as part of a student organization, an engineering student organization. And I think I've kind of leaned back on rhetorical because I think it allows me to think about performing one's identity in the world, right? In a way that I've always felt like, and this is getting, sorry for those of you who maybe don't care too much about the theory wonk stuff, but I've always sort of been like talking about as literate activity is too limiting for me, right? So I try to come up with like, okay, so rhetorical gives me, it's not just literate engagement, because we're not just talking about with texts and reading and writing, but unless you're really thinking about that as a sort of performance of identity, right, in the world. And there's all sorts of ways in which we're reading the world and responding to it. And I care about that more than I care about necessarily the individual students' writing skills, right? And so even in a lot of our reflections, they're not necessarily always talking about, oh, and then I wrote this thing, C here, right? It's like, how did I learn how to work with other people, right? That to me is like a being in the world kind of thing, right? More than it is, although it totally does play off of the writing process that's obviously central to the class. So I don't know if that's a sort of, but I guess I totally agree with you. I think that we have to be careful about imagining that writing is everything. I think that the big studies like Nessie show that, yeah, writing's super important, but it's not like the most important way that all students engage with learning. I imagine that's only more so for, you know, if you're talking about people who've been out of school, right, for a long time.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the shift between writing and rhetorical disposition. That's a no, I appreciate that comment. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I've lost Julie on that too. I see. Yeah, but I think like the other thing that I think that, you know, rhetoric, when we talk about rhetoric, it's that you there's a problem in the world that can only be fixed by responding to it in a rhetorical fashion, which means sort of performing some kind of communicative event. So in other words, I'm not going to solve this problem by pulling out a gun or by punching somebody or, you know, some other kind of brute use of force, right? That I'm going to have to use some kind of communication skills. And of course, we can think about communicating with our whole bodies in the world. So it doesn't have to be necessarily the way in which, oh, okay. Yeah, and the way in which, yeah, we sort of you know, have to limit everything to writing, even though I think understanding writing as a broad part of a broader ecology of the ways in which we're sort of communicating in context is important. So yeah, tell me, Julie, what did you mean then, in terms of, you're saying you don't know what? Oh, okay, you're laughing because you know that we all oversell ourselves. Okay, yeah, I got
So
that.
much. Yeah, it was hilarious.
Sorry, I didn't get the joke. Yeah, at first. We have one more minute here, or a few more minutes anyways. Yeah, and I really appreciate you bringing up that point in the chat that, like, you know, that students, like, that something being wrote is not bad in the fact that people are constant, like having someone do something over and over again is pretty important, right? That's our argument for writing across the curriculum, right? That students have to encounter these tasks over and over again in order to sort of figure it out, and that they're not going to learn something in one class and totally remember everything and bring it into the next situation. So we do have to think about how we make certain things rote, even if those rote things are sort of challenging things. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Rebecca, for that comment in the chat. We're not going to solve most of this stuff in the next couple of minutes. Debbie, I mean, I always think of writing as a kind of as kind of like creating texts, and I can even think about that as, you know, you can be more of like what we call sort of multimodal, right, where you're using images, video, whatever, right? But it's that sort of creation of an artifact, right, that's supposed to communicate something to somebody. So, which, you know, I think again, you can get into this thing where everything becomes writing, but I've always in my mind tried to like say, okay, I'm not going to try to tell everybody everything's writing. So for me, it's like the creation of these texts, right? Which can be performances or whatever else, like Rebecca's skit for her reflection. I would still kind of call that a kind of active writing, maybe. And so Tara, you're asking, did you use presentations? Do you want to elaborate on that, like as an instructor or having students do presentations? What do you mean?
Oh, I meant I was talking about students doing presentations as far as what they learned and sharing and connections, because I think the writing, the reflections, sometimes they don't take them as seriously, but the presentations they do. And I just wondered if you did that in your classes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I like to do is not have them just present to me again, right? Because if it's just another sort of reflection practice for me, right? They've already been going through this motion. So having them, you know, again, it's like with, let's just take the breast cancer resource center project, right? So they're presenting, yes, they're presenting to me on like regular, every few weeks. I got to be like, actually every week the teams are presenting to the class and presenting to me about where they're at in the project. You know, what are they struggling with? What are they getting right? But then, you know, they also have to have project updates with the community partner. And then they're also presenting to the community partnership center. And then they're also presenting as part of our celebration of student writing, which is, I think, a thing I forgot to include in the slide. So they are having, like, and especially if you're a team lead, you are taking a lead role in presenting. And it's a really interesting point, Terry, that those team leads are not just reflecting in these documents, but they're having to stand up in front of people multiple times throughout the semester and explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, and ask questions and answer questions. So maybe that plays a role in it, in terms of why we see that difference in those reflections.